Echo of Death, a Tom and Scott mystery, fifth book in the series. By Mark Richard Zubro, publisher, St. Martin's Press, New York, narrator, Eric Ost. Acknowledgements. For their kind help and patience, Barb D'Amato, Hugh Holton, Rick Paul, and Kathy Pekaiser Reed. Chapter 6. To our right, the back of buildings extended 20 feet and ended in a chain-link gate, which prevented egress in that direction. To the left, the alley twisted and curved toward Wrightwood Avenue. Because it had only one exit, the alley was unfrequented. "I don't like this place," Scott said. "We'll hurry." The gray and chill of the day before had returned on a rising northeast breeze. The mid-October afternoon gave a grim forewarning of an unpleasant winter. I zipped the jacket Lester had brought me and pulled the collar closer around me. The buildings surrounding the alley presented oblique, sooted, encrusted faces towards us and cast elaborate shadows that made the alley seem even cooler and more sinister than it needed to be. I wished I had a heavier coat. At the last curve before Wrightwood, Scott grabbed my arm and pointed. I saw a row of behemoth-sized plastic garbage cans, and the gathered shadows behind them, at ground level, I saw a hint of blue fabric. Scott hurried over and moved one of the containers. Behind it was Brad. Together we stooped over him. He was on his back. I saw blood seeping from a wound above his left ear. The seam on the right sleeve of his jacket had been ripped open. "How bad is it?" Scott asked. "Let's get those two fags," a voice called. I looked up to see 5 guys who all looked to be in their mid to late teens, approaching us from the Wrightwood Avenue end of the alley. It is far too common for gangs of young straight guys to come into gay neighborhoods, hang around, and wait for gay people to beat up. These guys must have known the exit for the womb, that the alley was rarely used, and waited for victims. I stood up and faced them. I felt powerful and invulnerable as adrenaline rushed through me. I didn't see any weapons. I knew that Scott and I could take care of any 5 unarmed teenagers. "Let's take them," I said. Scott yelled, "Fire!" The 5 teenagers gave him an odd look. They took a couple of paces forward. Scott continued to bellow. Scott's response was certainly one of the ones that was highly recommended by police departments. A scrawny, bi-pimpled kid, and a shortest one of them, with the scraggliest hair, said, "Nobody's going to hear them. It's a bluff. We could take them." Nevertheless, 3 of them hesitated. Scott tried shouting, "Fire!" again, but no people appeared at any of the dirt-begrimed windows or at the dilapidated and padlocked doors. "Ain't nobody but us and the fags," said the skinny kid. He came forward with the confidence that his buddies would follow. I decided not to wait for rescue or for them to make a concerted move. I launched myself forward toward the biggest one. Maybe as tall as me, but at least 50 pounds heavier. He went into a defensive crouch at the last second. I pivoted to the right away from him and slapped the palm of my hand up and into the bridge of the skinny kid's nose. He collapsed to the ground. One of them grabbed me from behind. I lifted my right foot and brought the heel back sharply against his shin. He let go. The big one tried to grab me in a bear hug. As he reached, I sent my hand, darting for a grasp at his genitals. I connected with the soft folds of the front of his jeans and a significant portion of his dick and balls. I did my best to crush them in my grip. He screamed and fell to his knees. Scott had the wrist of one of the others held up against the kid's back almost to the neck. The 5th one ran off. The wailing of fire truck sirens made a delicious sound. Someone had been listening. The firemen called the cops. When they arrived, I told them for sure we wanted to press charges. They took the kids away. The official constabulary was impressed that one of the guys having been attacked was Scott Carpenter, the famous baseball player, but seemed a trifle confused when he and I insisted that it was a hate crime, gay bashing, and not just an ordinary mugging. An older cop with grizzled white hair and a limp took down all the information. He wanted us to take Brad to a hospital soon after the arrival of all of the official personages. Brad sat up. He claimed he didn't want assistance. I wanted him at the police station as soon as possible. It might be going over the police radio about the identity of the mugging victim as a well-known baseball player. That could alert all kinds of people, some of whom were not out to act in our best interest. "Why'd you run out on us?" I asked at one point while the police were busy loading teenagers into the squadrol. Chicago's version of what in an old gangster movie would have been called a paddy wagon. Brad shrugged. "I thought I recognized two guys who walked in," he said. "I panicked. I've never been stuck like this. Glenn's dead. I'm really scared. I was afraid to trust you guys. I thought you might sell me out." "To whom? For what?" I asked. He scratched his head again. If I saw that gesture a whole lot more times, I'd shave his head bald myself. We drove to the police station in a blue and white cop car. Scott and I sat in the back seat and Brad up front next to a cop who was more than delighted to ignore the gay aspects of what had occurred and concentrate on the fact that he had an all-star pitcher in the back of his car. We talked baseball for the mercifully short trip to the station. My lawyer met us at the admitting desk. Todd shooed away all the solicitous and inquiring cops and asked for and got a private room to talk to us. "What the hell is going on?" he asked when we were finally alone. I told him the story while Scott and Brad slumped in gray metal folding chairs in a gray walled room with a painted gray wooden table. Todd was tall and waspishly thin. His charcoal trousers were held up by black suspenders stretched over a white shirt. He wore a perfectly knotted tie. He'd spread his gray suit coat over a chair. I'd only ever seen him dressed as if for court. If I asked him about his attire, I knew he'd say that for a trip to the police station it never hurt to look one's best. It might be impressive at the right moment. He wore glasses with thin gold rims. His sunken cheeks and crinkles around his eyes added to the impression he gave everyone that, with a few minor alterations, he could have been anyone's maiden aunt. He often sounded like it, too. After I finished my story, he thought for several minutes and said, "I'll be right back." He returned in 5 minutes with two uniformed cops who escorted Brad out. "I need to talk to you guys alone," Todd said after they left the room. "Brad might try to run," I said. "I called in a favor," Todd said. "The commander of the police district and I have worked together before. Throwing Scott's name around didn't hurt. Those two guys will keep him safe." Todd rested his skinny butt on the top of the table. I stood near the door. Scott remained in the chair. "What have you found out?" I asked. "Several bits of information," Todd said. "First, Old Man Proctor is generally regarded as an honest real estate dealer. No known shady connections. As Lester said last night, Mrs. Proctor in the same business as her sort of ex-husband, and the two of them are incredible rivals. Like Blake and Alexis on Dynasty?" I said. Todd frowned. He didn't approve of popular culture and music. He preferred Gregorian chant. Anything tuneful later than 1899 was an anathema to him. He, on occasion, deigned to watch a silent movie, but hadn't been to a talking movie since his freshman year of high school. He spent his free moments rereading Samuel Richardson's or all 32 of Sir Walter Scott's novels in the order they were published. "It's a classic case of two separated people into each other viciously and irrevocably," Todd said. "I found out that before their marriage they were competitors. My source says that it was a strange union. In the early years of the marriage, Mr. Proctor hired a gigolo to catch her in a compromising position. Meanwhile, she hired a prostitute to do the same to him. In this case, a picture might be worth 1,000 words, but it could also be worth millions of bucks. Eventually, they wound up trading pictures, realized what they'd done, and had a secret meeting in Hong Kong to try and make peace." "How'd you find out all this stuff?" I asked. "My accountant is the smartest lesbian on this continent. She knows an enormous number of secrets about rich people. I have her looking into both Proctor's dealings for illegality of any kind. If it's there to be found, she'll find it." Todd took off his glasses, pulled out a handkerchief, and polished his lenses. When he had them settled back on his nose, he continued, "They discovered they turned each other on with their aggressiveness, sort of fellow cutthroats, piranhas in bed with each other. For a few years, they tried to stay apart, but the attraction between them remained incredibly powerful. Sounds nuts, Scott said. And people get turned on by some odd things, Todd said. They ended up getting married and even had kids. Glenn and Bill, the marriage didn't really put an end to their competition. Eventually, they dueled for their kids' affection. For a couple of years, they holed up in separate wings of that big mansion up in Lake Forest. What ended the marriage? I asked. They aren't divorced. That's why I said sort of ex-husband. They're separated. Haven't lived together in 5 years. Why not divorce and be done with it? Scott asked. Who knows, Todd said. Business, a sick attraction, power, could be anything. Reportedly, they would do anything to hurt each other in business. Nuts, Scott said. That may be, Todd said. What I also found out is that they were both interested in several large deals down in Mexico lately, especially with the North American Free Trade Agreement that was signed recently. My source says that the son, Glenn, was sent down by Daddy to do some work for him, although it wasn't clear whether it was licit or illicit work. As an older son, Glenn supposedly was quite a disappointment to his father. I don't suppose he dreamed about having a drug addict, has-been baseball player for a kid, I said. Not a dream come true, Todd agreed. So how does that affect us? Scott asked. I'm not sure, Todd said. The kid comes back from Mexico and says he's in trouble and does not run home to Mommy or Daddy. I would think they've got enough money to cover up almost anything. Enough cash to buy off an unhappy South American drug lord? I asked. Todd shrugged. From the way you described Glenn Proctor, he seemed to be living out some Terry and the Pirates fantasy. Maybe he was just trying to win his parents' love and affection, Scott said. You have an invitation to talk to Mrs. Proctor? Todd asked. I nodded. Then go talk to her. She might know something that will help. The people after you have to be placated. I'm not sure how you go about doing that. We discussed that for half an hour, but got nowhere. The old cop with the limp came in and said, We got a mob of reporters out here. I want to talk to Mr. Carpenter about what's going on. You going to hide it? Was it gay bashing? Todd asked Scott. No, Scott said, but I'm not sure I want to talk to them now. Whoever's after us has probably heard where we are, I said. Todd agreed. We left the room. The cop limped over and pointed out the window. Minicams are here. I glanced out at the crowd of milling reporters. I saw a few I recognized from the 10 o'clock news on different stations. I also saw several people in the ubiquitous charcoal gray suits. I had come to associate with those people after us. If they were minions of South American drug dealers, they did not fit the cliché look as presented on so many American television shows. They looked neat, clean, and respectable. I didn't see the big guy with the blonde mustache and bald head. I could get you out the back, our cop buddy said, and left to arrange it. Can we get police protection? Scott asked. Probably not, Todd said. We should hire personal bodyguards, Scott said. I've already taken care of it, Todd said. Guards may simply draw attention to you, but we've got to at least try. You trust these guys? Scott asked. I've used this company before, Todd said. When I called today, I didn't say who they'd be protecting. They have no way of knowing that I'm your personal lawyer. I trust them. Protection is only a temporary solution. If these people want to kill you, they will. You've got to try to find them so you can negotiate. You've got to find out how Glenn managed to connect you with what he was into and what to give these guys to make them go away. I do not have high hopes. You mean we're dead already? Scott asked. I'm not going to start lying to you now, Todd said. I've always told you the truth before. You are not in a good position. I could make a statement on television, Scott said. I'm well known enough that the media would let me talk. Todd considered this for a few moments. Finally, he said, let me try to work out some kind of announcement, although a plea to a drug lord for understanding sounds kind of iffy to me. I was forced to agree. We've got to get out of here and someplace safe, Scott said. I want to talk to Mrs. Proctor, I said. Yes, that has to be done, Todd agreed. Let's get the cop to get us out of here. The longer that crowd mingles in front, the less comfortable I am. Todd left the room and a minute later returned with our cop buddy. Out in the hall, two guys who'd been sitting in the plastic folding chairs near the front desk when we came in got up. I'd assumed they were criminals in a drug bust. They had long, stringy hair of an indeterminate brown shade. One guy had his pulled back in a ponytail. He looked like he had a slight paunch. The other was scrawny and had the deep scars and red residue of violent acne all over his early 20s face. I didn't see a gun visible on either one of them, but they wore sweaters and jackets under which they could have been concealed. Todd introduced them as our protection. I pulled Todd aside. "These guys are guards." "The best," Todd assured me. We gathered Brad and our little group trudged down a gray corridor around a bend and into an interior garage. At the door I asked, "Where's Brad?" Todd hurried back the way we came. He returned in a minute with a look of concern on his face. "Two guys claiming to be his lawyers came to see him. Cops let them talk to him." Todd shook his head. "They're all gone now. Nobody saw them go." "Let's get out of here." The cop piled us into a squadrel. We drove out of the parking lot and onto Addison West, past Wrigley Field and north up Clark Street. We stopped at Irving Park and Clark and got out. The cop got an autograph from Scott, gave us a cheery wave, and left. "I'll do more searching," Todd said. "Be careful. Those two guys are good, but don't take any chances." Our guards waited a discreet distance away. Todd hailed a cab and left. The two derelict-looking guards sidled up to us. "You guys have a car?" I asked. The one with the ponytail nodded. "You have names?" Scott asked. Ponytail's brown eyes stared into Scott's for several uncomfortable moments. Then he pointed to himself and said, "Bernie," and then pointed to his buddy and said, "Angelo." They made no fuss or mention about Scott's being famous. I found this refreshing and disconcerting. Their car was a 1975 Chevrolet with the tailpipe dangling down and back, a pair of dice hanging from the rearview mirror, and a statue of St. Christopher on the dashboard. None of this was tremendously reassuring in terms of expecting great protection from these guys, but I knew Todd would hire only the best. Scott and I piled into the back. In front, Angelo shoved his seat all the way back. Scrunching into my knees, he propped his feet up on the dashboard, pulled out a toothpick, and proceeded to clean his teeth. I gave Bernie the address Mrs. Proctor had given us. Bernie drove with the elan and aggressiveness of a mad cabbie. On a late Monday afternoon, the traffic on Lakeshore Drive through the loop to the near west side of Chicago was fairly heavy. Even though school kids got out for Columbus Day, most people had to work. A lot of the near west side had burned down after the Martin Luther King assassination in 1968. For years, most of it hadn't come back, and much of it was vacant lots and old factories. Over time, the westward expansion of the loop had begun to reinvigorate the area. Presidential Towers was one of the big developments, along with Oprah Winfrey's Harpo Studios. Others had followed, and now some of the area had trendy restaurants and old factories and warehouses converted to upscale condos. We followed Lake Street west under the L tracks. The slated track and the rusty metal above made for a gloomy corridor down the still unrenovated portion of this end of the near west side. On the south side of Lake Street, between Elizabeth and Racine Streets, was a block-long warehouse, 5 stories tall, built of dirty maroon brick and occupying the entire block. The address we had directed us to Willard Court, little more than an alley which bisected the entire block and the warehouse. Both sides of Lake Street were filled with cars. After working hours, this area cleared out quickly. A few blocks earlier, the streets had been nearly vacant. Here, cars crowded nose to nose, but few places seemed around to justify their existence. No marquees for a trendy restaurant appeared. We halted at the entrance to Willard Court. I could see that it was actually a cul-de-sac with several black limousines parked amid a plethora of semi-trailer trucks. No one seemed to be bustling around at this time on a Monday afternoon, but it was inside Willard Court that we had been directed to go. Bernie bobbed his ponytail in the direction of the glorified alley. "You sure about this?" he asked. I looked at the address again. Yeah, I said. Doesn't look too promising. I don't know, Scott said. We'll go in with you, Angelo said. He took his feet off the dashboard, reached behind his back, and pulled out a gun. He checked to see that it was loaded, then shoved it back in the hidden holster. Bernie nosed the car into the entrance to Willard Court. He almost ran over one of the denizens indigenous to Lake Street and the near west side. The cops on the street called them he-she's. The rest of us called them transvestite prostitutes. They, along with their sisters and a rare brother, plied their trade along the dark depths beneath the L tracks. She tapped the hood of the car with a gloved hand, winked at us, and swayed away on her spike heels. Angelo made no attempt to park, but pulled 20 feet inside and let the car idle. Here, our perception of the alley changed dramatically. Recessed into the wall on the left and running for 20 feet with a plate glass window. Through it, we could see brightly lit, plant-strewn elegance. A woman in black pants, white shirt, and black tie with a black and white patch on her shoulder that said security marched up to the car. At least she didn't brandish a weapon. On the other hand, we didn't get a smile and a welcome. She motioned for Angelo to roll down the window. Here to see Mrs. Proctor, I said from the back seat. She pulled a radio from her belt, stepped a few feet away from the car, pushed a button, and spoke. Moments later, she came back and asked our names. After I told her, she murmured into the radio. A moment later, she nodded. You can't park here, she said. Mason and Carpenter are expected. You want to go in by yourself? Bernie asked. No, Scott said. I need some guarantee of our safety, I said. She gave me an odd look. You can't park here because you need a special permit. You have a special permit. Head shook. Then you have to move. We need some kind of guarantee, I repeated. You can leave if you want, she said. If you want to see Mrs. Proctor, you'll have to move the car off the premises and come back. She didn't sound mean and nasty, just like a bureaucrat, insisting that her orders be obeyed. She seemed in no rush to hurry us off, nor did I think she would change her mind any time in this or the next century. Park the car, Bernie, I said. I want to talk to her. You can come in with us. Bernie backed the car out and found a space on Elizabeth Street, a half block from the warehouse. We walked back to the entrance with them. We passed another of the he-she's, this one in a short leather red dress and pink shawl, draped around her shoulders, barely enough against the mild October chill. Back inside, I saw that Willard Court, whether alley, street, or redeemed cul-de-sac, was spotless for all the trucks and the incumbent garbage that must emanate from them. Not a scrap of paper was out of place. Someone must sweep the alley several times a day. The windows above the shadowed alley all seemed opaque and featureless, like any other abandoned warehouse. But none of these were broken out. Inside the entrance, I saw two other security guards, beside the woman we had already met. They were all excessively polite as they escorted us deeper into the building. We ascended stairs of naked wood, newly constructed and unvarnished. I caught the whiff of fresh pine. We entered a room containing banks of television screens. A lone guard nodded at our escort. Two of the guards, with us, sat down at stations and immediately commenced a security check with the first. We were ignored. The guard who had accosted us in the alley led us across the room. Good security system, I said. You need it these days, and in this neighborhood, she said. It may be upscale, but it isn't the safest yet. The fourth side of the room was completely glass. It extended up 2 stories and looked out on an English garden landscape. We walked through a sliding glass door. I saw that this atrium extended up 5 stories to a skylight that stretched the entire width of the building, as did the garden. The hedges were trimmed perfectly. Flowers bloomed in riotous abundance, and a brook flowed from a small waterfall from our right to out of sight on our left. The fragrance was an early June meadow along a pristine stream. Someone had invested a huge amount of money in making the interior of this relic of a building an oasis of refinement. The guard led us through a series of paths to an elevator. She rode up with us to the 5th floor. The doors opened to a marble floor that covered an office that must have encompassed a quarter of the entire floor. 2 rows of sleek steel and aluminum desks set in front of us. Most seemed to have computers and plants prominently displayed on their tops. To our left and right, huge rubber trees and enormous pots flanked the entrance. Just beyond them, on each side, were paintings by René Magritte, an odd, surrealistic touch in this modern office, except for the humming of neon lights and the whir of what I presumed was the heating system. There wasn't a sound. The guard prodded our elbows gently, and we followed her through a door at the far side of the room. We entered a 20 by 20 foot room. Against the old brick wall on the far end, rows of plants nearly engulfed a teak desk, at which a woman sat. Mrs. Proctor wore her hair cut straight to the sides, almost shoulder length, with nary a curl. Flecks of gray peeked from among the light brown. I doubted if she colored her hair. She wore a Tahari beige silk sarong jacket and trousers and matching 9 West shoes. She rose from the desk. The guard left. Mrs. Proctor met us halfway across the room. She led us to a small seating area of low-slung black leather chairs and couch with a chrome coffee table in front. The gray light of October seeped through a skylight directly above us. After we were seated, she asked if we wanted refreshments. We both said no. Bernie and Angelo stood against the door. Mrs. Proctor nodded in their direction. "You need bodyguards," I said. "After we explain, you'll understand." She nodded, then said, "I've been trying to get back to you since you phoned. Something is wrong." "Mrs. Proctor," I said, feeling awful to be the one telling a mother that her son was dead. "Glenn was staying with us when we came in early yesterday morning." I stopped and gulped. Telling Bill or Mr. Proctor had not made this moment any easier. "We found him dead." She rose slowly to her feet. Her eyes never left mine. "I'm sorry," I said. She seemed to totter. Scott jumped up and rushed to her side. She leaned heavily on his arm. She covered her face with one hand. "Please," she said. "Please, this can't be true. I went to... He's supposed to be..." She moved her hand away from her face. "This can't be true." "I saw him," I said. "I touched him. I wish it weren't true." "Why haven't the police called? What is going on?" She sat back down. Scott stayed next to her. Mrs. Proctor's hand trembled as she pointed at me. "Tell me what happened." I told her the story from the beginning. I left out a great deal about the tunnels, figuring she wasn't interested. When I described our re-entry to the penthouse and finding the body gone, she rose to her feet. She disdained Scott's preferred arm. And what did my husband say yesterday when you told him?" she asked. She had enough cold in her voice to freeze all the moisture on the planet in seconds. "He claimed we were wrong," I said. She strode behind the couch and leaned against it. I have never seen a more self-possessed, more controlled, and more furious person. "Oh, he'd say you're wrong because he'd know he'd somehow killed his son. If one of his idiotic schemes has gone haywire and it killed my son, I will not rest until every bone of my husband's body has endured a pain." A tear started at the corner of her eye, but her voice did not waver. "I will break him. I will destroy him. All the devils in hell will not have suffered as much as my husband when I am through with him." I didn't dare interrupt her spectacular diatribe. She pulled a lace hanky out of her jacket pocket and dabbed at her eyes and nose. She said, "I loved Glenn so much." Her fury spent, she now leaned against the back of the couch, propping herself up with both hands. She lowered her head and shook it back and forth as she said over and over, "It can't be." I had no idea what to say, so I said nothing. When her voice had run down and she'd stood for some time in silence, I said, "Is there something we can get you? Someone we can call?" She looked up at me and shook her head. "I want to sit down," she said. She matched the action to the words. Scott reseated himself in the chair next to me. With her hands folded in her lap and her eyes shut, she breathed deeply for several minutes. Without opening her eyes, she said, "Tell me again what happened." I did so slowly and carefully, including what had happened to us since we found her son. When I was finished, she spoke so quietly that we had to strain to listen. "Glenn was my favorite," she said. "I know mothers aren't supposed to have them, but I couldn't help it. He always wanted to be independent and free, always had a mind of his own, rebelled against being under his father's thumb, as I did against my father when I was a child," she sighed. "He had so many gifts. He could have been so many things." I didn't add that something in his upbringing had contributed to his drinking and drug addiction, and that her little boy was hardly a saint. I suppose she knew that. I hesitated bringing up the drug lords. I wasn't sure who we could trust with that knowledge. "We've been trying to find out what he was doing in Mexico," I said. She looked startled. "Working for me? Mr. Proctor told us Glenn was working for him." "He couldn't have been," Mrs. Proctor said. "Glenn had specific people to meet for me, information to gather, and on-site inspections to make." "Do you have contacts down there who could give us information?" I asked. "I have several business offices." "What kind of information?" "He must have been doing something down there that led to his being killed here." "Possibly." "Why Mexico?" Scott asked. "Huge potential for growth," Mrs. Proctor said. "Lots of possibility for rapid expansion. We've got mall deals that could make anything in this country look like peanuts. It's practically virgin territory down there." "Why send Glenn?" I asked. "Why not?" she countered. I tried to phrase this delicately. "I never heard of him having the best head for business." The edges around her lips almost pulled up in a smile. "I was always trying to find something for Glenn to do. Anything that could give him a sense of worth. Distract him from his vices. I wanted to help him give him a sense of responsibility." Mr. Proctor had said nearly the same thing. Both seemed eager to help their son. "Glenn would never have worked for my husband," Mrs. Proctor said. "Why not?" I asked. "We were bitter rivals, and Glenn took my side in the family disputes. He disliked his father and didn't trust him. Her husband had given us no indication of this attitude, and what she said contradicted what Bill Proctor had told us. I wonder what the father and brother's opinion on her comment would be. "Why was there so much rivalry?" I asked. She snorted. "Jason is a jerk, but a lucky jerk. He came from money, but my family is old money. Yes, he's wealthy, but I built an empire larger than his, and I didn't need his help. He hated my being richer than he, that I made better investments than he, that I was more respected around the world than he ever could be. Our marriage was tempestuous, to say the least. The heights were wild, but ultimately we couldn't stand each other." "And you used the kids as pawns in your rivalries?" Scott said. "How dare you say such a thing?" she exploded. "Because you didn't really know your son at all. You're angry at your husband, but neither you nor he seemed really worried that something happened to your son." "How dare you?" she demanded. "I was his friend," Scott said, "which he needed very badly. We used to talk a lot when he was going through his suspensions. He wanted to succeed in baseball so badly, he told me, because his talent was something neither you nor your husband could touch. If Glenn weren't dead, I'd feel sorry for you, and your husband might not have pulled the trigger, but you helped drive him to his vices and his destruction." Her icy cold was turned on us. "I don't have to listen to this." "I don't care what you listen to," Scott said. "We're leaving." He got up and walked toward the door. In silence, we retraced our steps back to Willard Court. As we turned into Elizabeth Street, I grabbed Bernie. "Look," I said. I pointed at a car parked in front of ours, a nondescript gray sedan with two men in dark clothes sitting in front. "I think they were the ones out front of our hotel," I said. Bernie and Angelo thrust us into a nearby doorway. They put their hands near their weapons and advanced carefully on the duo in the car, who continued to sit almost casually. Seconds later, two very confused and angry maintenance men from a nearby factory had their legs spread and hands on top of the hood of their car. Meeting Scott Carpenter, famous baseball player, mollified them enough that they weren't going to press charges. I'm sorry, I said when we got back in the car. I've gotten so paranoid. Forget it, Angelo said. Better to be safe. They uttered no word of reproof. Where to? Angelo asked. We've got a few belongings at that hotel, Scott said. We can pick them up and then, with you along, make it back to our place. Maybe we'll be safe with you there. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.